By the time I had a child, and that child was old enough to make sense of the Passover story, I had written my own easy-to-follow version of the Haggadah for reading out loud at the Seder table. By the time my daughter, Grace, was old enough to grasp the idea of atonement, she and I began each year to take a walk in the woods, or at least on hiking trails in a park just north of Columbus, the closest we could reasonably get to woods, and talk about the year that had passed, about our regrets and sorrows, pausing at the end to throw pebbles into a stream below a bridge, silently casting out each of our sins, silently asking forgiveness. How much these changes have to do with a trip I took in 1987 to Poland to visit what remained of the little town my grandmother was born in and where she lived until she was 15, I don't know. How much they have to do with the traveling I did then, that year before I began my teaching career and moved to the place that would end up becoming my home for good, traveling all through Poland and into what was then Czechoslovakia, visiting the few synagogues and Jewish cemeteries that remained, lingering at the old Jewish cemetery in Prague, which dates back to the 15th century, where I sheepishly wrote a note of hope for my future, I didn't call it a prayer, and slipped it into one of the cracks in Rabbi Yehuda Lowe's grave, as hundreds of thousands, millions of others had done in the 378 years since his death. I don't know either. Rabbi Lowe, known as the Maharal, is said to have created a golem, a man made of clay brought to life by faith and magic. I didn't believe that. But then I wasn't thinking about belief or disbelief as I stood in Jewish town's ancient cemetery among 12,000 stones marking graves that had been planted vertically in rows of 12, because there was not enough room in the cemetery to bury everyone who had died, and Jews could not be buried anywhere else. Among stones that tilted every which way nearly 6 centuries after the first of them had been set in the ground. I didn't think about belief or disbelief either when I began to set aside a day for atonement each year, or to collect a shank bone and fresh horseradish for my Seder table, or later to ask my husband, the Southern Baptist, who has excellent carpentry and construction skills, to help Grace and me build a sukkah each year, with branches laid across the top so that the stars could be seen in the sky when we were inside it, eating our dinner among the gourds and Indian corn we'd strung and hung from the roof for decoration. All of these things, all of these changes, felt both sudden and natural, surprising and completely predictable, like coming home after a long time away from home. Coming home to the music of my childhood took longer. I left it sooner, while I was still a teenager, and also returned to it later, not until after I had a child and found myself offering up to her the music of my childhood, as well as all the music I'd come to love since then. When I rocked the baby Grace to sleep, I sang Meredith Willson. There were bells on the hill, but I never heard them ringing, as well as John Lennon. Now the sun turns out his light, good night, sleep tight. And Lord Nero, cocaine and quiet beer. She wasn't old enough to understand the lyrics, so I figured they couldn't do her any harm. I sang one song after another without ever stopping to think beyond what song next. And as she got older and began to request her lullabies, she would ask for songs by Gershwin, The Grateful Dead, Johnny Mercer, Robert Johnson, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Joni Mitchell, the Rolling Stones, As Tears Go By and Wild Horses make excellent lullabies. And I would sing them to her one after another or make medleys of them for her as if they were all of a kind. People will say we're in love, segue into love in vain. Who knows where the time goes, or just like Tom Thumb's blues led right into On the Street Where You Live. And so I introduced her to the songs of the great musicals without even thinking about it. Introduced her to songs I hadn't thought about for over 20 years, songs I didn't even know I remembered. She was 3 when she saw the movie The Music Man on television for the first time, and then she wanted to see it, as small children will, again and again and again. Watching it with her again and again, a videotape we made of the TV airing, complete with commercials, reminded me of, or reawakened me to, how much pleasure there was to be had in a musical. And when a faithful revival of The Music Man opened on Broadway 4 years later, Grace and I flew to New York to see it and sat in the front row, and we were transfixed together. I was 45 by then. If you'd asked me 10 years earlier if I believed I could be transfixed by The Music Man on Broadway, I would have laughed. I would have said there was no reason I'd ever see a Broadway production of The Music Man. And even at 45, I had no doubt that I had bought those wildly expensive tickets for my daughter. That left to my own devices, I wouldn't even have gone to see the musical version. that left to my own devices, I wouldn't even have gone to see the musical version of James Joyce's The Dead, which was also running on Broadway at that time. I might have bought tickets to Arthur Miller's The Ride Down Mount Morgan, but more likely I wouldn't have gone to the theater at all. I didn't go to the theater when I visited New York for the first dozen years or so after I left. It never occurred to me when I went home to New York to set aside time for the theater. I spent my time at art museums and galleries and bookstores, or shopping, going to the movies, the kind of movies that would never make it to Iowa in the mid-'80s, or Nebraska in the later '80s, or Columbus, Ohio from 1988 on. Or meeting friends for lunch and dinner, coffee and drinks. Someday I'd meet 4 different old friends in 4 different restaurants or bars. And I walked from one end of the city to the other and indulged in feeling sorry for myself because I didn't live there anymore. All of which I still do, with certain adjustments for changing times and my changing self. In the quarter century that has passed since I left New York, independent bookstores have mostly vanished, just as they have nearly everywhere else, and some interesting movies do come to Columbus now. But it doesn't matter because I don't go to the movies. I wait for them to come out on DVD and rent them from Netflix. Most of my old friends, even the ones who hung on long past my leaving, have also left by now. There's no need to race from place to see them all. There are only a few of them left to see. An even bigger adjustment, though, is that these days I have Grace with me when I go to New York. She longs for the city almost as much as I do and considers it her second home, her ancestral homeland, she calls it. Luckily, she's the perfect travel companion for me, since her idea of a good day in New York is, like mine, to crisscross the city on foot, stopping periodically at restaurants, or just slowing down briefly to get a slice of pizza and an Italian ice. She too likes to feel sorry for herself because she doesn't live there, and she can just barely get away with the anymore because she did live there for a year between her 2nd and 3rd birthdays. She even has about the same level of museum tolerance as I do. 2 hours, under normal circumstances, 3 if enthralled. Her father, on the other hand, can contentedly spend an entire day in an art museum. If he is with us, as he occasionally is, we leave him there and wander, returning for him at closing time. But the biggest adjustment, the most surprising adjustment, is that whether Grace is with me or not, whenever I'm in New York now, I see a musical or 2. See, I always come back to my point. When she is with me, we will often see several. We think nothing of seeing 2 in the same day. And there's no way for me to untangle my renewed love for the musical after so many years of disdain from my love for my daughter. Had I not had a child, possibly even had I not had this child, I'm not sure how I would have or why I would have made my way back to musicals after the roughly 25 years I consigned them to childhood, to my parents, to Brooklyn itself, which, by the time Seesaw opened on Broadway, I was just waiting to leave. And I would, too. As soon as I was able, practically the very second I graduated from Brooklyn College, less than 3 months after my 21st birthday, when I moved out of my parents' apartment and into the Greenwich Village garret of my dreams. Because I dismissed all the music I'd grown up on, painting all of it, obscuring all of it with the same thick brush, one is so clumsy at 17, at 18, at 20. One does not discriminate, one obliterates. The show tunes and the sentimental piano music, Arthur Rubinstein playing Chopin's waltzes and Schumann's piano concertos, not to mention Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, Sammy Davis Jr., Jerry Lewis's Just Sings. I swear to you, if I close my eyes and concentrate, I can still hear Jerry Lewis singing Come Rain or Come Shine and Rockabye Your Baby with a Dixie Melody, and it's awful. And most of all, because my father was enthralled by him, Al Jolson. And here I must pause to tell you that my father used to perform as Al Jolson in blackface and wig, lip-syncing the songs, getting down on one knee, this is really true, and that when I was a little girl, we both performed at a Catskills Resort talent show, him doing Jolson, as he'd been doing since he was in the Army, on stage entertaining his comrades at Fort Hood, and me singing I Enjoy Being a Girl from Rodgers and Hammerstein's Flower Drum Song, and Wouldn't It Be Lovely from, of course, Lerner and Lowe's My Fair Lady, neither of which I'm going to sing to you today. And he and I were awarded first and second prize, respectively. I should also mention here that I was so inundated with Al Jolson in my childhood and so much in my father's thrall that when I was given the assignment to write a biography as a final project in the 6th grade, I chose Jolson as my subject. I still have the little book I wrote, complete with flat copy and Polaroid swinger author photo in which I posed like this. Because, as I say, I dismissed it all, when Seesaw opened in 1973, I had no reason to know or care that there was a line to be drawn between the absolute coolness of my beloved Billie Holiday, the totally hip adultness of her singing I Must Have That Man, and what I considered to be the utterly middlebrow, corny, sentimental, polar opposite of everything I meant to be in the world of the Broadway musical, my parents' world, which Seesaw was a part of, even if it wasn't actually, factually a part of it. I asked my mother the other day over the phone, we talk every morning while I walk the dog, if she'd seen Seesaw on Broadway back then. She'd never even heard of the show, she told me. But then I sang her that little bit of It's Not Where You Start, that I sang to you. And she said, I know that song. How does the rest of it go? So I sang the intro, sang it into my cell phone via Bluetooth, actually, hands-free, singing as I walked down Tulane Road, crossed Calumet, headed toward Olentangy, the dog's leash in my hand. Sang it walking down the street for all the world as if I were in a musical. If you start at the top, you're certain to drop. You better watch your timing. Better begin by climbing up, up, up the ladder. If you're going to last, you can't make it fast, man. Nobody starts a winner. Give me a slow beginner. A slow beginner. Yes, that's what I am, in every way I can think of.